So who were the Ferries?
Okay, William and Amanda Ferry were Presbyterian missionaries, came to Mackinac Island. Well, William came in 1822 in the fall, spent the winter sort of getting a lay of the land, started a Presbyterian congregation with 9 members. He went back to Massachusetts in 1823 in the summer. He was from Granby. Amanda White lived in Ashfield. They were married and came back to Mackinac and opened a school of boarding scholars. And most of the children who would be at this school ultimately would be Métis children who had Canadian fathers and either and indigenous mothers, some of whom were Métis and some who were tribal. And so the Ferries came, but with they were evangelical Protestants, which would clash with the Catholics at the clerical level. And that's important, I think, to remember as I talk about some of the things that went on in the interrelationships between Catholic priest and Ferry, is that this is going on at the clerical level. Now, on the street, I'm sure it's happening, but it's not necessarily going on in the way it is between the priest and the minister. So they came, started this boarding school, and 12 scholars, and where do you think the boarding school was housed? The home of Madame Laframboise, this very devout Catholic. The Ferries came to educate these children. And one of the things that was going to people should know is the English language. And these children who came, for the boys, their first language, most of them was French. And for the girls, it was either an indigenous language or possibly French. They probably knew both. And the boys probably also knew the indigenous language, but their usage was different. The language in the home was probably somewhat different than in business.
Great.
And then, of course, to teach these children to become, first of all, they wanted boys to become farmers or artisans. They resisted. And it really, and one of the concessions that the Ferry made was they really were training them to become better fur traders by the things they were teaching them. They were teaching them mathematics. They were teaching them English. They were teaching these children geography, history, and of course a big dose of biblical teaching.
Yep.
And the girls, they really wanted to make them homemakers, which fit more closely with the lives and the culture that these children came from. And so, in a sense, it really became a goal to make them better homemakers, and for both boys and the girls to be able to fit into this new world that was coming. Great.
And now please introduce our 4th main character, which is Father Samuel Mazzucchelli. And, I'm a pretty well-informed Catholic. I had never heard of the name of Father Samuel Mazzucchelli until I was talking with Keith. And he said, of course, you've got to talk about Father Mazzucchelli. And I said, who is he? And I've come to learn a lot thanks to Keith. But so, can you give us a little bit of a background on Father Mazzucchelli?
First, I will say that there is value in conversations that happen on the street.
Totally.
Well, I'm going to start with Father James Mullen and Bishop Edward Fenwick to introduce Mazzucchelli. Mullen was editor of the Christian Advocate in Cincinnati, and Fenwick was the Bishop of Ohio. The Diocese of Ohio was created in 1821. And of course, Fenwick was just basically for Ohio, but ultimately it came to include big chunks of maybe all of Michigan, Wisconsin, and maybe even larger areas. And Fenwick was acutely aware of the lack of Catholic priests in his diocese. And another thing that you want to remember is that the Erie Canal opens in 1825. And so the immigration of Americans, European Americans, to Michigan and to the West is really, really picked up. And so there are other Catholics, besides Catholics in the fur trade company, who need priests. And so Fenwick had sent out an appeal for European priests to come and basically do missionary work in North America, which was nothing new in history. I mean, the Jesuits were missionaries from Europe.
Right.
And so in 1829, Fenwick and Father Mullen came to Mackinac and were quite shocked by the state of the church. And Mullen challenged Ferry and Ferry's teachings and Ferry's denunciation of Catholicism. And Mullen then, his efforts in responding to Ferry helped to put new energy into Catholicism on Mackinac Island. And so both Catholics and Presbyterians then were seeking new converts. And they both Mullen and Ferry set down their opposing views of Christianity, or they attacked the views of others, some really vicious rhetoric. I didn't really try to find much to illustrate that, but it was pretty nasty. And of course, one thing in thinking about this, I would say it's important to maybe remember the Reformation was 16th century. So this is like only 300 years, or
Right.
I mean, that may sound like a long time, but what we're talking now was 2 centuries ago.
Yep.
And so, and Ferry represented the anti-Catholicism that was quite prevalent in New England, which they had brought with them. The colonists from England had brought an anti-Catholic attitude with them, and then there were those who believed that Catholic priests incited some of the native people to attack New England settlements and the like. So there's a history on Ferry's part of anti-Catholicism that comes with him.
Yeah.
This doesn't just happen out of the blue in terms of his mind. And Mullen denounced Ferry. Read a few of the things that he accused him of. Said Ferry had forced an Indian woman to live at the mission against her will, that he operated a sailing vessel for profit and denied it, that missionaries got unneeded donations of clothing and sold them to buy personal items, that he identified the Métis children on the Mackinac Island as being Indians in annual reports to the government. And then he leveled this charge. This is one quote I have here, accusing Ferry of being a minister who claims the honor of having been commissioned by Christ to teach and instruct the ignorant, with his eye fixed upon filthy lucre, and holding the shears in his hand, by which he intends to secure the fleece of the flock, a denominated by the meek and the humble Redeemer, a hireling and no shepherd.
Wow. So this was not, even though there might have been a fairly friendly relationship between La Framboise and the Ferrys, what you're saying is the relationship at a clerical level was not good.
Would be bad. That's right.
And so into this context, Father Mazzucchelli responding to Bishop Fenwick, as well as Bishop Barriga, and many other priests came at that same time because of that appeal. So he comes to, I think, first to Cincinnati and is kind of ordained a priest, and then Bishop Fenwick sends him to Mackinac. Is that right?
Right. A little background on Mazzucchelli. He was born in Milan, Italy in 1806 to a prominent family. He went away to school. In 1823, he left home to join the Dominicans, the order of preachers. In 1828, he answered Fenwick's call to come to Cincinnati. And he was not an ordained priest at that time, but he had further education, and Bishop Fenwick ordained him. And he was then appointed to come to Mackinac Island. But the area he was to minister to included more than that. It was to include Green Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, and maybe even go down as far as Fort Winnebago, which is near the junction of the Fox River and Wisconsin River, and Prairie du Chien. So Mazzucchelli, with this as his bare bones background, comes into an environment where the nerves have been frayed, and the Catholic Church has been denounced by Ferry, and so he is going to be responding. And his native language, of course, was Italian. He knew some French, but virtually no English. And so I suspect that he communicated largely in French and maybe some through an interpreter, but that's not very likely because I don't know who would have known Italian on Mackinac Island. So there's going to be, some language issue. Mazzucchelli then and Ferry then engage in a series of debates, but never head-to-head. Mullen challenged Ferry to debate him face-to-face, and Ferry refused. And Mazzucchelli and Ferry never debated face-to-face either. It was thought maybe Ferry was very uncomfortable in that kind of a situation. But here are some of the things that Ferry lectured on.
So in essence, what would happen, and you can, if I understand, in essence, Ferry would give, in essence, a lecture, a homily, a sermon, where he would state his position, and then Father Mazzucchelli would give a teaching where he would state the Catholic position. Was that
right? And it would be, and we'll go back and we pick up Madame Laframboise again, but Ferry would be speaking after 1829 when the Mission Church was built. He'd be speaking in his church. Mazzucchelli would be speaking over in St. Anne's Church, just down the street a ways.
right?
But here's some of the these are the topics that Ferry would be talking about: the doctrine of the infallibility of the Church, the supremacy of the Roman See, challenging the Pope, the differences in Eucharist or the transubstantiation, the invocation of saints and angels, the sacrament of confession. And then he gave a final review of his lecture. He gave a series of 5 lectures, and the 6th lecture was a summation of them. Mazzucchelli responded, and his actually, and Ferry's sermons do not survive. At least no one has a record of copies of them existing. Mazzucchelli's sermons do survive, but I'm sure they're in Italian, and I don't know if anybody has ever translated them. So,
Okay, you've given me a challenge here, Keith. But anyway, I'll have to do some research.
right. Well, you need to go to the Dominican Archives.
Yes.
That's where the stuff is, in Cincinnati, Wisconsin.
Cincinnati, yep.
Yeah. And so Mazzucchelli was, certainly affected by the Protestant denial of the infallibility of the Roman Catholic Church. That got right at the heart of the Church's presence and authority. And he termed it as the most important foundation of all religious controversy. Then one more quote from Mazzucchelli. Because we are certain that our servant established on earth a church, a body of persons particularly consecrated to him, invested with divine authority, with which he solemnly promised to remain till the end of time, to teach her all truth. We need not hear the quarreling Christian to find a religious truth, but to hear Christ's church. Mm-hmm. And so it's, again, they were talking really about fundamentals here of theology, and in this kind of argumentation, there's really little effort to find common ground. And one of the interesting things I have found, which was really fascinating, was the explanation of a conversion, of what it meant to come to know Christ and come to know Jesus Christ as your Savior. From the Catholic side and the Presbyterian side were hardly different. And so, but anyway, that's just a aside. But so, and again, the differences between the Catholics and the Protestants here was that, the Roman Catholics interpreted Scripture. Mm-hmm. The Presbyterians, individual, Martin Luther, the Reformation. I interpret the Scripture. It isn't Father so-and-so who interprets the Scripture for me. The Presbyterians did not believe that priests could absolve people from sin. Again, a very important piece of Catholicism. And what you would find if you were to study Catholicism over the years at St. Anne's Church, that when these people came in the summer who had been out in Minnesota or Wisconsin collecting furs, trading for furs, They found their way to the confessional.
Mm-hmm.
The Presbyterians did not believe that baptism resulted in salvation. The Presbyterians rejected the doctrine of purgatory. They rejected transubstantiation. They did not believe that the body and blood of Christ were actually physically present, but they were spiritually present. And the Presbyterians condemned the use of images for religious purposes.
And what's so fascinating, Keith, is really nothing over the last 200 years, not a whole lot has changed in the sense that the same arguments that the Pharisees were making against the Catholic Church are really the same things we hear today.
Right.
And so there was, it really is the case that it was very similar to the debates that are still going on.
Right. But I think not with as much anger.
Yes,
right.
Hopefully we do it with much more charity on both sides that we understand that we all love Jesus and that, yes, we have some profound disagreements, but there's a sense of shared mission, I think, that did not exist back then.
Yeah, and I think you find also today that there are shared ground on social issues like abortion.
Yeah.
In others, where there are Protestants who, like say at our church, are very opposed to abortion, as is the Catholic Church.
Right.
And you can probably look around. There are other issues where you see, we share things that are in common.
Yeah, we have come. I think as the society around us has become increasingly post-Christian, I think the different denominations have realized we really need to stand together where we can because that's so important.
I agree, yeah. So we'll go back to Madame Laframboise now. We sort of dropped her, but the main facets of her life, because she's the only person who is really native to Mackinac Island of these 4 people. She was a highly successful trader. She carried on the family business after Joseph's death. After 1815, with the advent of the power of the American Fur Company, she continued to trade, sometimes with the company, sometimes independently, but was able to acquire a significant wealth. She was committed to education, as we mentioned earlier and got into earlier, but as I said, she probably almost certainly learned to read, but I don't think she learned to write. There's difference of opinion on this, but when you look at her last will and testimony in 1846, she signs her name with an X, which was highly unusual. She knew how to write her name. She turned her home into a school. As I said, she hosted the ferries in 1823, but she after the ferries were out, she hosted a school that taught them Catholicism, taught the Catechism. One of her students, Sophia Bailey, taught for 15 years in St. Ignace, so she trained other teachers. She hosted visiting dignitaries, which is really kind of a fascinating piece of this. This in itself would make an interesting vignette to go back and some of the accounts that are given here. She would host prominent Indian chiefs or Indian leaders. She hosted people like Bishop Fenwick, visiting priests. She hosted Mazzucchelli. In fact, Mazzucchelli opened a school for Catholic children on Mackinac Island in her home. She hosted at one time Zachary Taylor, who as a military man who would become president of the United States. She hosted Lewis Cass, who was the territorial governor of Michigan. She hosted sometimes prominent writers who would come through, like Margaret Fuller. And she also hosted Alexis de Tocqueville, which is, and all of these people were very impressed with her graciousness, her generosity, her knowledge, her sensitivity, and that all worked together to form an important part of her legacy. Another thing that was significant about her was she was concerned about the poor. And of course, probably most of her deeds of mercy for the poor are unknown. But she did provide for an Indian woman who had been abandoned by her relatives. In her will, she left $50 for the most poor people on the island. And perhaps above all, she was a devout practicing Catholic, even without a regular priest. she would say Angelus 3 times a day. And apparently the church bell would ring at 6 in the morning, at noon, at 6 at night. In the 1820s, she donated land for St. Anne's Church. The new church needed to be built. The building that this church was replacing was the church from Mackinac. It had been carried over on the ice in 1780 and reconstructed, and that had been the church.
So the church, if you go to Mackinac Island today, and many of us who go to St. Anne's, what I think you're saying is that site is where the church was built after it was moved from downtown, right?
Right. I was the church from Mackinac that was moved over on the ice was reconstructed downtown.
Right.
And then the church that stands in today, St. Anne's, is built in the 1870s. And the church that it would have replaced would have been the 1820s church that was built on land donated by Madame Laframboise across the street from her house.
Right.
And
so that house directly next to St. Anne's is where Madame Laframboise lived.
Right, across the street, yeah.
Okay. Is that the one that's is it across the street in the terms of, or is it actually on the beach of the island, or is it the one that is now it's a inn, right?
Right, the Harborview Inn.
The Harborview Inn.
Right. Yeah.
So so as a visitor, if you go to the Harborview Inn, you're actually going to Madame Laframboise's house.
Right.
Though much expanded.
Not much expanded. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Great.
And so, and as I said, she hosted Mazzucchelli when he first came to the island, so she lived a life that was consistent with Catholicism, and was a leader of Catholicism, and helped to keep the faith, the church, alive.
Yeah. Well, and you know what I am so inspired by, only because of you that I've learned about this wonderful woman, is the fact that she was married, she was a mother and a grandmother, she was a successful business person. She was a métis, she just was such. Well, for me, as a non-cleric, just as a normal grandpa and dad, it's like, yeah, this is somebody we can look to as an example of how to live our faith.
Right, and also I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that she was able to adapt and make changes to the changing world around her, and that helped keep her faith relevant, not only to her but to others.
Great. And if you go to St. Anne's today, and if you go to the lower level of St. Anne's, there's actually a small museum that Brother Jim Boynton, I think, was very instrumental in, and I hope to have Brother Jim on one of these episodes in the not too distant future. But there is the tomb of Magdalene Laframboise right under the church, because I believe that was one of, when she donated the land, I think she said something to the effect of, I would like to be buried under the church. Is that right?
Well, I'm not quite sure whether she's under the church or she's outside the church.
Well, the tomb is literally in the church in that museum. So I was there when I saw it last summer.
Okay, there I'm going to have to claim ignorance. Not quite sure where the tomb is. But
anyway, that's where it is. So if those of you are interested in learning more about Magdalene Laframboise, Keith has actually authored a wonderful article. I think the only place you can buy this is in the lower level of St. Anne's, where they have a gift shop and a bookstore. But it's called Magdalene Laframboise, the First Lady of Mackinac Island. Keith has authored several books about the Straits of Mackinac and the history. The one that we talked about that's directly about the ferries is called Battle for the Soul. And this is Métis Children Encounter Evangelical Protestants at Mackinac Mission, 1823 to 1837. And this was your dissertation?
Correct.
Okay, great. And that's a MSU publication, right?
MSU Press, yes.
And most of Keith's books, I think, are available at the Fort Michilimackinac gift shop and bookstore. The one that I love, I mean, this is only one of many that Keith has written, but it's called Beyond Pontiac's Shadow, Michilimackinac and the Anglo-Indian War of 1763. So that's another important time period in the history of the Straits of Mackinac that we could, I'm sure, have another great episode on. But one of Keith's other books, and there's many others.
Yeah, and that one I would encourage people if they want to buy it through Mackinac State Historic Parks. On the website, it would be available, and it would be considerably less expensive than if you bought it from the press.
Great. So the website for the Fort Michilimackinac, right?
Right. Website for Mackinac State Historic Parks.
For Mackinac State
and
Historic Parks.
they'll have on their menu of publications.
Great. So for those of you like me who love to read, those are some things that you might want to add to your reading list. So thank you, Keith. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
You've been listening to Fish on Friday. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.